And with that, it's my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Craig Tiriak, Vice President of Product Management at Scale Computing. Craig, are you there?
I am. Dave, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Great to have you on. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on today. Yeah, so I had planned to kind of give a high-level overview of who Scale is quickly and talk about our HT3 product, which is our flagship HCI product, and spend some time talking about HCI in general. But based on some of the other vendors that you have on here, I don't think I necessarily have to go into a ton of detail about that. So instead, I want to spend the majority of my time actually doing the demonstration of the product, assuming I can get screen share working correctly. Real quick, though, let me tell you who Scale Computing is. So we were founded in 2008, and back in 2012 is when we first launched that flagship product called HT3 that I was referring to. And really, since then, we've amassed thousands of customers in enterprise, really distributed enterprise, more than data center at the enterprise, small and mid-market companies. And, I mean, you name the industry, we're really kind of across. It's really anywhere that there is a need for simplicity in the infrastructure. So that typically is the case anytime you have limited to no IT resources on premises. And so that's where we've seen a lot of success. This is the part that I thought, well, I'll just tell you what HyperConvergence is. And I think based on some of the other vendors you've had on here and just how long HyperConvergence has been around in the space, I think most people understand that this is kind of that combination of compute, storage, and virtualization layers into an appliance form factor. I want to kind of harken back to a few years ago, back when this was a very common deployment methodology, and just talk about the pros and cons of it, and then introduce HT3 as kind of the next version of how this should work and the data protection functionality you get along with that. So in this deployment model, this is what we like to call a 3-2-1 model. It's actually still fairly common when people are migrating onto HT3. They're often coming from a solution that looks like this, where you're taking a handful of host servers and you're loading either VMware or Hyper-V or some sort of hypervisor on top of those. You're connecting them down in through redundant switching into either a SAN or a NAS. So using iSCSI or NFS. And as you can probably tell just by the layout of this slide, it's fairly complex. There's a lot of layers to it. There's a lot of understanding that you have to have expertise internally or through kind of a managed service provider to be able to come in, set this up, and manage it effectively over time. With that complexity, though, comes some positive things. I mean, the biggest benefit to architecting something like this means that, if, say, that first host in this environment were to fail, because you have shared storage, because you have protection at that storage layer, you can fail over the virtual machines from that node into one of the other hosts in the system and still, kind of maintain that highest available uptime that you possibly can for the environment. But again, at the cost of all the complexity that comes along with it. So along comes HyperConvergence, along comes our HT3 product, and we've done some radical things to simplify that stack in such a way that it looks as if that the storage on those nodes are directly attached to the virtual machines running on them, meaning that you don't have to mess around with iSCSI or NFS anymore. So with that as the setup, let me tell you about HT3, and then I'll just dive straight into a demo. We'll spend the majority of the time there. HT3 really is all about four things. It's all about simplicity, high availability, scalability, and then affordability. And again, we're targeting really distributed enterprise where you've got hundreds of maybe thousands of sites where each site needs just autonomy, essentially, because you don't have anybody on premises to run that infrastructure, or small and mid-market companies where you have IT generalists that are in charge of the entire infrastructure and don't necessarily need or want to have the skill set of every individual layer in that stack that we just covered. So with that, let me go to one more slide here. So these are some of the topics I'm going to be talking about today in this demonstration. We're going to walk through the snapshot functionality, high availability. We're going to talk about replication and how that works to either a local target or a remote target, or possibly even to our HT3 Cloud Unities, the DRaaS as a service offering that we have. Let me share my screen, though. And Dave, I'll just verify, are you able to see this okay?
Yes, sir. Looks good.
Fantastic. Thank you. So what you're seeing on screen is a 3-node HT3 cluster. And this happens to be an HE150, which is at the lowest end of our product line. These are really small form factors, great for a remote office, branch office, or a retail environment, or maybe the S of the SMB. Oftentimes we'll see this sold through managed service providers to those smaller clients that they have. It's while you're looking at this as an HE150, it wouldn't matter if it's an HC 1000 or an HC 5000, the entire product line shares this same interface. And so let me talk you through that. Ahead of the call here, I've taken these nodes and I've put them, they happen to be in a rack. I've plugged in power, I've plugged in networking, I've assigned an IP address to each of these nodes. And then the first step you take is to initialize a cluster. And what that does is it aggregates the storage of all of these nodes together so that it acts as kind of a unified resource pool to be able to start creating virtual machines. So the first thing I really want to talk about with being able to protect the data in your environment is just local high availability, which is fairly common at this point, but the simplicity of the HT3 solution I think is fairly uncommon. So here I'm going to create a new virtual machine called ATM. I'll give it a tag, which is just a logical grouping here so I can kind of keep all my virtual machines here together. Oftentimes we'll see Windows and Linux variants, but to be perfectly honest, really anything that's x86 based is going to virtualize and run just fine on HT3. And we do include performance drivers for Windows and Linux and what you see here. It's a matter of just selecting how many CPUs do I need, how much memory do I need, what's my drive size. So if this is a Windows VM, this would be my C drive. Of course, I can add additional data drives, and all of this is thinly provisioned. And then the last step is just selecting what ISO do I want to use to boot from, and then click Create. And so, just like that, in a matter of really just a minute here, I've created a machine. I'm going to turn it on. It's automatically highly available. I haven't had to deal with any of the complexity of a traditional environment to make that happen. And the intelligence of the system is going to place this virtual machine on one of the nodes in the system. Looks like it's placed it here on node 1. And if node 1 were to fail right now, whether it's a drive failure, node failure, we'll be able to handle and tolerate that failure. So if it is a node failure, what happens is automatically, without you as the administrator having to log in, these virtual machines that are sitting here would just restart on the other nodes in the system. All that's handled seamlessly. Of course, because we are sharing the storage across all the nodes in the system, and for those of you who want to get into the details of it, we're striping and mirroring across every drive, every disk, in every node in the system, which means that when that's pulled together, I can do things like live migrate these workloads from one node to another without having to worry about impacting any users that are logging into those workloads at that time. Now, of course, what's nice about that is we can make use of it for things like rolling upgrades as well. So, when you talk about data protection, it's really all about trying to maintain the highest possible uptime for your workloads. Some of that is planned. A lot of that is unplanned, and the majority of what we're talking about today is unplanned, but the planned downtimes are also impactful if you can't fit them in the right hours. So things like having rolling upgrades to be able to apply updates to the BIOS, to the firmware, to the storage stack, the hypervisor. When it's tested kind of as a unit, the way we have with HC3, you can apply that and not have to worry about it being run even oftentimes during the workday, right? So that way this works is you apply the update here. I actually have one showing here in the UI. I click on that. I apply the update. It's going to start with the first node in the system, make use of that live migration functionality to move it to another node, upgrade all those items that I just mentioned in the stack, and then when that node is back up and nominal again, it will migrate those workloads back to it and then just rinse and repeat all the way through. So I think that's a fairly good understanding of what HT3 is in general, and the basis of which is that high availability. But there are additional things that you can do in here, such as snapshots. So snapshots are this is one of the more unique things I would say about how HT3 operates. The snapshots that you can create on HT3 are effectively run as what's called allocate on write, which means that there's very minimal impact at the time of actually taking a snapshot. It's metadata based and not actually creating a full copy of this snapshot. There's also, because of the flexibility of how we've created this, really you can create hundreds of snapshots without impacting the performance of the VM itself, and do things like clone them off at that point in time. Now, I think I mentioned that we include performance drivers with the system. We also include a guest agent, which you can use to kind of coordinate quiescing a VM as well. So these are all crash consistent snapshots by default, but if you have that guest agent coordinating that quiescence of a specific application, you have an application consistent snapshot that you can restore to as well. So just in simple terms, what that means is here I've taken just 2 manual snapshots on the system. If I want to go back to one of these in time and clone from it, I just click the clone button. I can give it a new name, give it a new description, kind of apply what I'd like to on that, and then click clone. In the background here, it's creating a new VM. Now, while these are all collected together and displayed as as part of this ATM virtual machine that I've just created, there really is no link between them that I need to necessarily worry about. So if a particular snapshot needs to be deleted, that's not a big deal. You can kind of keep as many as you want and handle them however you want with that. And these clones that you're creating are automatically bootable. So I can go ahead and spin this up. I can put it on a separate network if I want to do that. I can disconnect the network entirely, but it's fully writable at the time of cloning it up. Now, while that was a manual snapshot, you don't necessarily want to sit around your entire day waiting around to take manual snapshots of your data to make sure that they are available to clone from. You really want to automate that as much as possible. And so having the ability to set up schedules and have more of a policy-driven snapshot schedule really becomes critical for operating in today's IT environment. And what this allows you to do, in fact, I'll kind of pull up a recurrence rule. You can set really as granular as you'd like. Typically, we'll see people go down to as many as 15 minutes for that lowest in recurrence rule, all the way up to monthly of how often do I want to take this snapshot. And then maybe even more important than that is how long do I actually want to keep it around. So being able to define both the recurrence rule as well as the retention schedule for that snapshot is critical. And notice that there's an extra option here, which is set different for a remote retention. This is all about replication. You don't always necessarily want or need to keep the same snapshots locally as you have remotely. And so we offer a lot of flexibility here to be able to say, maybe you only want the most recent snapshot on your local device, or maybe you want, hundreds of snapshots on your local cluster, but you only want the most recent one at the remote site. We give you that flexibility to be able to define that retention here. And then once you've saved that, you can apply it to, whatever virtual machine you want on that policy, and then it will respect whatever that schedule has been defined as. For replication, it's just one step further, which is, where do I want to replicate this to? So here I've actually already set up a replication target, this PM Indy HQ. If I hit replicate to it, it will take a snapshot. It will reach out, and here this another cluster that I'll log into, and you'll see here's the snapshot being generated on that remote site. So it took a snapshot. It looked out at this site to say, does this exist? If it does not exist, then I want to go ahead and create a snapshot and send it over the wire. And of course, it's going to compress that and send it in an encrypted way such that I will be able to restore on this side in the exact same manner that I just showed you locally, which is to clone off from that virtual machine. Now, I have already replicated a virtual machine here that I can use to clone from. I can either clone directly from this list, or I can just click the clone button here, and all of a sudden I've failed over from my primary site to this DR site. We see people do this all the time because it's so easy to accomplish. It allows you really to test as often as you need to feel confidence in the solution. Again, having the ability to either disconnect or maybe put this virtual NIC on a different VLAN to be able to come up in this remote environment. It's just a matter of powering it off and on, and you're off and running. And what's cool though is that restoring that back to the primary site is pretty seamless. In fact, all you would have to do for that is to set up replication back from this VM that I've just cloned off here. So let's say that I actually had a disaster and I absolutely needed to fail over all my critical virtual machines to this secondary site. I can spin them up, I can run them there as long as I absolutely need to, and then when I'm ready to fail back, I just set up a replication schedule back to that primary site and hit replicate. And it's going to do the same thing. It'll take a snapshot, it will look at this primary site and say, does this snapshot exist? Now, here's where that lineage comes in. While you can delete any of the prior snapshots without any impact to that running VM or kind of all the clones that are based around that, it is able to identify and say, what is the latest snapshot that I have in common between these two sites? Now only send over the differential between that last snapshot and the one that I just created here at the secondary site. So instead of reseeding an entire virtual machine back to this primary site, you're now just worried about the changed blocks that have happened since your prior snapshot or since you failed over. A couple more intricate things that we have here. Actually, first, this is unplanned, but I'll go ahead and show you. Some of the intelligence that's built into the system here is that we are monitoring thousands of conditions on every node in the cluster. One of the things we're monitoring is, are you running so many virtual machines that you're not able to actually tolerate failover? I mean, how great is that in an environment where you're worried about data protection? You want to make sure these workloads are up and running. You want to make sure you can get them back up and running in the case of a disaster or human error or ransomware. Having something tell you, hey, you're in a situation right now where if you had a node failure, you would not be able to tolerate that node failure. That's what's built into HT3. So that's actually what the warnings are here on screen, letting you know that. And that's sent out via syslog as well as email, and of course here in the user interface. What I was actually going to show next, though, is some of the more advanced functionality here. So here I've got a Windows VM here. It's pretty basic. I can't remember if it's 2000. Yeah, I think it may be a 2019 version that I'm running here. I do have a guest agent in here, so it's passing through things like the mount points, my C drive, my F drive. Those snapshots that I keep referring back to, if you actually go into the details of these, we do list things like those mount points, right? So let's say you had a user that deleted a file and you needed to restore that file for them. If you have an idea of when that may have happened, you can go back to the snapshot where it was involved in, and you can either mount that virtual disk at that point in time to that running VM, or maybe even any other virtual machine that you have running in the system. Here, if I just mount this locally, in that Windows VM, you'll see a new volume that you can bring online, pull that file off, delete that that virtual disk that you just added on there, and kind of off and running. So here, if I go back to this this VM, you'll see that I now have, here's a new drive that has not been brought online, doesn't have a volume yet. Going into this Windows VM, I can go into disk management and should see this new volume here that I can bring online. I can find that file, I can restore that file, and then kind of do with it what you want to. But it is fully writable, readable, being mounted that way. There's a lot of other cool things you can do with that functionality that's just built into HT3. So I think that's, on the demo side, that's really everything I wanted to cover. But let me go back to our screen share here. Everything I've talked about really is what I would call our HT3 data protection suite. And as you could probably see from the demonstration, there's a lot to it, and a lot of different things, knobs that you can turn to dial it into your specific requirements around your RPOs, your RTOs, whether you want that to be replicated locally or whether you want that to be replicated to a remote site, or potentially even to our DRaaS as a service offering, which is kind of a cool, interesting thing as well, which is that we have virtualized a node, and we use that as a replication target sitting on top of Google. So the GCE is where that's typically run. With all that said, there are still situations where you might want to have a third-party backup product like Acronis. We have integrated with Acronis to be able to allow for agentless backup of HT3 VMs. And really where you're going to want something like this is if you're in an industry that has regulations that require really, really long-term data retention, this could be really useful. Or I showed off that file level recovery. Maybe you want something beyond that with object level recovery for databases or maybe email servers, that sort of thing. Acronis is really great at those things. Those snapshots that I talked about can protect against ransomware, and I actually have got some interesting stories around that with customers that have been hit with ransomware and just kind of reverted back to a prior snapshot and they're off and running. But if you want real-time ransomware protection, Acronis shines in this space. And of course, there are other use cases of where that might come in handy, and we've actually developed a product that we call our business resiliency system that takes these Acronis licensing and packages them together to allow you to use that as a local on-premises backup target, and then still be able to spin up your HT3 VMs on top of that target as a kind of restore point from Acronis. I will say, in all the things that you might read out there about scale computing and HT3, what you'll see as a thread throughout is that our customers absolutely love the product. And they do because it does exactly what we say it does. You can probably see in the demonstration today, it's all about transparency with us. I wanted to show you the product and exactly how it worked. And I can say that I've never read a review that said the first DR product to actually make me smile. I've never heard DR making anybody smile, but I'm happy to say that one of our customers actually said this out in the wild, so I grabbed the quote. There are thousands of reviews out there. I do welcome people to go to those reviews and talk to your peers and understand how they're using HT3 and why it is that they're giving us 5-star reviews. We kind of run the gamut from the small end of the HE150 that I just demonstrated from all the way up to really high end very, high capacity kind of core data center style of deployment. So really from edge to core all the way to cloud when you include our HT3 Cloud Unity offering. And Dave, that was really, everything I had prepared to talk about today. Have there been any questions that I can answer though?
Absolutely, Craig. We do have some questions for you from the audience. While we do that, we're going to bring up our poll as we always do at the end of each session, and I want to call everyone's attention to that. What additional information would you like about the scale computing solution? So let's see, Craig, as you said, your customers love you. Scott was commenting here in the questions pane that they're a scale computing user and they absolutely love the product. He said, I can personally testify that clone, replication, et cetera, is as easy as it looks. It was a huge selling point for us. Also, a lot of great feedback, of course, on your demo. So thank you for taking time to share that with us. Let's see, first question I see I want to ask you is about, they're asking, can I use an existing third-party backup product to back up an HT3 cluster?
Yeah, I probably should have covered that. Absolutely. In fact, many of the people that have demonstrated or talked today on your call can work with HT3. If it's agent-based, there's no doubt it will work. You basically just load the agent up and continue using it exactly how you have. It's really when it comes down to agentless where you would need to use either Acronis or the built-in replication functionality that offers agentless backups with HT3 today.
Got it. Okay. Question here, can I run Linux and Kubernetes in a HT3 cluster?
That is a great question. Yeah, in fact, I wish I had demonstrated from that cluster. I've got K3S running in my lab here locally, and we've got a lot of interest in that. And it's, based on where we have targeted our focus as a company, I will say in small and mid-sized companies, people are starting to dabble, but there's no real trend to pick that up quite yet that I've seen. Where we see more of that is in the edge computing space or distributed enterprise, where people are trying to roll out, on-premises kind of DevOps style of deployments of their applications on premises, and yeah, that's commonly used on top of Linux VMs on top of HT3.
Nice. Let's see. David is asking what automation options are available for scale computing.
If I hadn't known that these were coming from the audience, I would have guessed somebody at Scale was seeding these, honestly. So there are a ton. There are, well, first of all, let me say that there's a fully documented REST API that is becoming more and more commonly used. Even things like, one of the things I didn't really talk about here was just exporting virtual machines, right? So if you want to make use of, if you've got a standard NAS that already still has some life left to it and you wanted to make use of that, you could just use the export functionality built into HT3 to just export your full copies of VMs onto this device. We see customers that are making use of the REST API to orchestrate that type of thing, even through just like a PowerShell script to kind of call hey, I'm going to export, here's my target, and here's how often I want to do it. And then they have additional scripting that says, here's how often I want to delete those snapshots or exported copies of the VMs to maintain whatever archival story they need to tell internally.
Excellent. Nice. Brent says that he thinks affordability for this solution would be critical. Would love to hear you talk a little bit more in detail about how affordable is HT3. Yeah,
you probably saw on my one slide in there where it's like, here are the 4 things we always talk about. It used to be 3 things. We used to talk about high availability, scalability, and simplicity, with simplicity being the key to it all. But, I'm in the product management space. We talk to customers after every win and every loss that we have. We try to reach out to understand why. And I will say, more often than not, when we are talking to a customer, affordability comes up as one of the reasons they have gone with us, at least to start. Now, once they're on us, they love us for all the other functionality that I just showed off. But it's a matter of, does it do what I need it to, and then can I afford it? And affordability is absolutely key. Actually, surprisingly, I did not include the slide that has pricing on it in that edge to core to cloud, which is usually one of the things we do, because it's, again, it kind of goes back to that transparency I was talking about. We don't try to shy away from what those prices are, and it can be anything from, like at that low end with the HE150, sometimes those can be as low as $5,000 per node or less. And then you start going up into the upper end, and you can get into some pretty competitive pricing even at the upper end of our HT5000 line.
Nice. And then what are the options for backing up data to the cloud?
That is a good question. So I kind of breezed through talking about HT3 Cloud Unity, which again is more of a DR as a service offering, but some people do use it somewhat for that backup use case, just get their data off-site. But more often than not, so I mentioned exporting just to a local SMB share. We have some customers that will use cloud gateways and kind of back up to AWS or Azure through that cloud gateway, which is kind of interesting. It's in fact, I think I heard one of your prior speakers talk about having a local cache. That's effectively what that cloud gateway is. It kind of acts as a local cache, and then in the background we'll tier off the longer term archival backup VMs or snapshots to the cloud. And then I'll go back to our Acronis partnership. Through Acronis, you can use almost all the major cloud providers. I think I've even seen Wasabi listed in there as an option to be able to back up through that.
Nice. Yeah, a lot of flexibility there.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Craig. Craig, it's been really cool having you on. Great demo again. I'm afraid we're out of time here on our Q&A. There's some more technical questions for you there in the queue. But thanks so much for being here.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ed.